Well, the access of shelters for victims of sexual and gender-based violence is very essential to the work we do. The sad reality is that shelters are very scarce. For a very long time, we had absolutely no shelters. Like, we really didn't have. We kept on needing to fundraise online, uh, and we were at the mercy of good rates that some hotels and guest houses were giving to us to keep victims of sexual and gender-based violence safe. And we got the good ears of the Open Society Initiative for West Africa, OSIWA, and OSIWA supported us to get a temporary shelter. Before now, victims of sexual and gender-based violence used to do so many crazy things, such as, sleep at the police counters, sleep in very unsafe places. And so now we're able to provide temporary shelter to victims of sexual and gender-based violence, at least until the Office of the Social Development Secretariat is, functional. Prior, we hoped that victims would get support or succor only during work hours or civil service work hours. But now we're able to render round-the-clock care in line with the round-the-clock care that we give as first responders to sexual and gender-based violence. I mean, we're a survivor-run organization, and real-time support to sexual and gender-based violence victims is what we do. Steps that I think that the judiciary can take to help alleviate the sufferings of victims of sexual and gender-based violence include, first of all, online hearings. Having online hearings throughout the COVID-19 lockdown period, we didn't have access for people to procure restraining orders, amongst other very needed things, online. I think it's important for us to consider possibility of procurement of restraining orders to protect victims from their perpetrators within a maximum of 48 hours. And for this to happen effectively, it means that the judiciary needs to accommodate, the reality of the danger of victims this way. The judiciary also, we have a lot of problems with the people who are deaf accessing justice. A lot of people don't even bother because already the investigative systems have failed them. So they don't even bother with the judiciary. We look forward to more inclusive means of communication around the courts. Well, we try our bits to hold watching brief in courts, but with the prosecution, police prosecution, we have some very awesome prosecutors, very, very awesome, but some really, comparatively, no. The ones that don't give us problem are way less, way less than the ones that give us problem. The ones that give us problem, we need to find money for every time they make an appearance in courts. So it makes us wonder what the government is investing in. We will be happy for the government to invest in the prosecutors so that the prosecutors do not need to burden victims. We still have a lot of victims drop cases because they cannot afford how expensive it is. Then, in addition, the complexities of cases that have to do with sexual and gender-based violence, I think, is very underappreciated by the judiciary, because we have cases that have elements of crime in which the jurisdiction is the federal high courts, and then the same case, part of the elements of the crime should go to the high courts. And we have not been able to resolve yet the conflicts in this, and we have a lot of cases where law enforcement do not want to institute more than one case in a court over a matter because they say it is very expensive. So to that regard, I think that the judiciary, needs to accommodate for the higher courts to be able to absorb the rest of the case. Otherwise, in the long run, justice is denied the victim of sexual and gender-based violence, For cases of sexual and gender-based violence, a lot of emphasis is usually placed on the perpetrator and not the well-being of the victim. And so it leaves the victim feeling lost long after the court judgment, comes to bear. And so if deliberately um, the way the case impacts on the life of the victim is taken into cognizance by the court and due damages are awarded, then the court will be helping to make cases very expensive, to make crimes very expensive to commit. That's one thing. Aside it, it's about time that cases that border on Child Rights Act and the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act stop getting entertained by lower courts, the magistrate courts, the upper area courts, and upper area courts and the magistrate courts. Because what we see by and large are that a lot of very serious cases keep getting trivialized as soft landing for the predators to get away. So if cases border on what the Child Rights Act and the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act, cover, for the sake of integrity at least and for the interest of our shared humanity, those that are in the courts, the judges, the magistrates, should turn those down and request that the cases be instituted in the appropriate courts, so that at least there are maximum chances for sanity in society. There are certain things like paternity tests and the rest of them. I think it's important for the judiciary to insist that the mechanisms or the systems that the government says exist to support victims of sexual and gender-based violence bear the cost of paternity tests, because a lot of these things are very needed and they are very instrumental to pinning criminals to crimes. For funding for logistics of sexual and gender-based violence, the very first thing that should be done is to recognize that sexual and gender-based violence is an emergency. The National Health Policy Act makes provision for the government to offset the cost of emergencies. And so 1% of the consolidated revenue fund is supposed to go into funding emergencies. I don't understand why that money is not helping to pay the cost of medical bills, it's not helping to mitigate the very expensive cost of interfacing with law enforcement, it's not helping to pay the very high cost of duplicating files, amongst other things that we seem to see. I don't understand why such monies are not bearing the cost of payment of paternity tests, where we need to prove that the rapist actually fathered, the child that has resulted from a rape. I don't understand all of that. So it's about time. And this comes back to budgeting. We have spoken over time about gendered budgeting. If we don't take into cognizance what provisions are made for budgeting and we are not thinking along the lines, then we'll keep on missing out very important things. Remember that every issue of sexual and gender-based violence has a ripple effect and has direct impact on children, a possibility of direct impact on children. And when you bring up broken children, come to society with, completely different dynamics, which are by and large injurious to the nation's economy in the long run. And so, for logistics, we have the Educational Trust Fund and all of that. How about a trust fund deliberately to support victims of sexual and gender-based violence? It is very possible, it is very needed, and what would such a trust fund cover? Such a trust fund would cover increased sensitization on legal provisions and procedures. It will cover appropriate response to sexual and gender-based violence so that there's appropriate support for victims and there's ensured punishment for perpetrators. It would look at the standard of correction the correctional facilities offer. Are people just detained in correctional facilities, or is there any effort to actually, refine them so that they better function if ever released back into society. Yes, so, and then corporate social responsibility is another very important thing to explore. A lot of people get tax waivers, for different corporate social responsibility things. I think it's about time for government to give incentive to organizations that render corporate social responsibility to funding response to sexual and gender-based violence. Maybe the Dangotes will remember that they can fund sexual and gender-based violence because it's important. Response to sexual and gender-based violence is an emergency. That's why we have been calling on the government to declare a state of emergency on sexual and gender-based violence in words and in deed. After we lost UWA and the others during the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of people were talking. We're tired of the talk. We want some work. We want something that people can access without needing to know anybody or without needing you to parade cameramen so that you can give us. No, we're tired of it. And it's an essential service. It is. Lives are lost when sexual and gender-based violence is not properly responded to. So the protection of those of us that render these essential services need to be recognized. We need to be recognized as essential service providers, and we need to be, secured. We need to stop being targeted at by police for exposing the corruption that makes people keep dropping cases. And where we amplify cases, of attacks against us, we need them to be acted on. We are working in partnership with the government to eradicate sexual and gender-based violence. And so if we are not protected real time, then it's counterproductive to the nation's war against sexual and gender-based violence. If you don't speak, then you are promoting crime. Whatever you see, you say. It's about time also that we explored opportunities of mass education, like using film appropriately. My best approach would be to empower people that own the stories to tell their stories and give validity to their stories, as against forcing us to tell stories through patriarchal lenses. I don't have a problem with people getting funds to tell their stories through patriarchal lenses. But it's about time that deliberate funding was made available to us that have experienced these things to tell our stories, to inspire more people into positive attitudinal change that would eventually help eradicate sexual and gender-based violence in Nigeria. Aside it, until victim support is a reality, we keep on re-traumatizing and re-victimizing people. Many people are taking their lives by the day because of the hopelessness that they feel, resulting from sexual and gender-based violence. The trivialization of sexual and gender-based violence into family matter is one of the biggest triggers for suicide that we have been seeing around. And so it's about time that more stiffer penalties were meted out to people in law enforcement that help cover perpetrators' tracks. The number of cases that are trapped in legal departments and investigation departments of law enforcement are counterproductive to the nation's fight against sexual and gender-based violence. We need this solved. We need this tackled. We need this addressed real time. When women and children flee violent situations, keeping them with their many children many times, in one room is counterproductive to the fight against sexual and gender-based violence. What we're saying is that in the event of sexual and gender-based violence, be ready to live with practically nothing. Be ready to reduce your standards. Be ready to put up with mental health challenges that come with your loss in standard. I'm not saying that everybody's going to have the same standard maintained, but at least something decent, where a woman has boys and girls, especially the ones that are growing. I don't think it's fair to lump her with all her grown children, 6 children, 8 children in one room. How do you even arrange the beds? They cook in that room. They do everything in that place. I don't think it's fair. Until there are shelters in every local government in Nigeria, we have not done right by victims of sexual and gender-based violence. Because some people can actually operate by going to work from the shelters. You know, a lot of people have had to give up their means of livelihood just to be safe with their children. So how can we get to the point where people can be safe and still retain their means of livelihood? They shouldn't lose, you know, their source of livelihood as well. And then one of the very biggest things plaguing Nigeria is the forced financial dependence. And the fact that there's really nothing that makes it very important for people to take child support seriously. We need to see more and more people lose their jobs simply because they did not take child support seriously. We need to see people sent to jail because they didn't take child support seriously. First of all, the woman is forced to financially depend on the men, then at will the men kick the women away, leaving them with a lot of children to cater to as a means of punishment for not doing the bidding of the man, whatever that is. Even sperm donors must be held accountable for child support. Think about how this would impact the economy of Nigeria positively, because it means that no child will be left abandoned without basic education. It means that the burden of responsibility of seeing to catering to children would not rest only on women but on women and men, because there is the upbringing that men should give the children and there is upbringing that women should give the children. There is upbringing that every human should give the children. It's not a burden that should rest solely on women, which is what it is. And so, yes, let's think about how this directly impacts Nigeria's attaining the Sustainable Development Goals and act in line. It's teaching time, saves 9.